We all know that NeurOptimal works, but many still ask about how it works and what's the science behind it. And it's really interesting to me that those kinds of questions keep coming up again and again and again and again and again. And I'm reminded of somebody who I worked with a long, 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 long time ago, actually around the time of the five-phase model article. Um, and he came from a long distance, would do some intensive sessions, because we were doing a lot of that back in those days, actually, with people who came a distance. And at the end of the first time, I said, he asked me, is there anything I can do to, kind of facilitate this or consolidate or whatever? And I said, well, you might want to think about getting back into yoga, because I knew that he did that. Um, you might find that that's useful. And I went, oh, okay, well, maybe I will. Anyway, a little while went on, and he came back. Again, we did some intensive training. And at the end of the time, he said, is there anything I can do to kind of facilitate or, consolidate this? And I said, again, well, you might want to consider getting back into yoga. And he went, oh, okay, that's a good idea. This went on for 4 more times. And finally, one time he came in, and the very first thing he said, he looked at me and he said, I realize now that every single time I asked you that same question, and every single time you gave me that same answer, and I didn't even hear it until I was driving back home after the last set of sessions. And it's like, yeah, well, it is interesting how that happens. And my sense is that the majority of these kinds of questions arise because of past exposure or even current exposure to other paradigms in neurofeedback, psychology, or medicine. Um, you know, Trying to speak the language of another paradigm is kind of interesting. It's kind of like doing a language translation of poetry. It's very difficult to do. Um, Alice in Wonderland was translated into Spanish, French, and German, and there are different puns and jokes and visual illusions in it because of what's possible and not possible in each of those languages compared to English. So it was a very interesting process to try to translate that and convey the sense of it being this sort of humorous, like the mouse with the sad and long tail. And who's telling the story, and I can see how it's sad, but how is it long, or I can see that it's long, but how is it sad? And how do you convey that across all those languages? Because the illusion is a little bit different. Anyway, many out there, and even in our user community, could really benefit from allowing what I call a Copernican revolution in how they think about those fields. And this is exactly what I talked about in the five-phase model article. In fact, I'd say the most important thing in the five-phase model was this central Copernican shift in how to think about what was going on in neurofeedback. There were some other specific things that were important, like 7 hertz as opposed to theta within alpha theta and that sort of stuff. But all of that actually involved aspects of the Copernican revolution. So what today is kind of a bird's eye view of the transformation that occurs because one undergoes such a Copernican revolution. You shift from the older Ptolemaic idea where the Earth is the center of the universe, and it's incredibly complex mathematics involved to make that work. It works. In fact, Ptolemaic astronomy predicts all of the movements in all of the observable bodies to exactly the same degree that the Copernican shift does, at the Copernican paradigm, where the sun is at the center of our solar system and we're not even near the center of the universe. It's just that one's a lot easier to work with, and the Copernican is a lot easier to work with. So that's a transformation from the one coordinate system to the other. And one can do that back and forth quite easily if you want to. But then the question becomes, how do you choose which paradigm to go with? Do you go with something that is easy, or do you go with something that's very complicated? And a long, long time ago, philosopher Occam came up with what's known as Occam's rule, which is whatever is simpler is preferable. So you don't want to multiply explanations without any benefit from them. And I want you to keep that in mind in the background, because really this day today is about the transformation that allows for you to understand NeurOptimal, but also allows you to be able to let go of many of those questions, because many of the questions only make sense in the other paradigm, just like retrograde movement of planets only makes sense if you put the Earth at the center of the solar system. From a Copernican point of view, it makes no sense to talk that way. That's not how it works. So there are 4 good starting points for today, and I've sort of put them in historical order. If you've not looked this material over ahead of time, then I would really strongly suggest that you do look it over afterwards or as you can. The first one is The Project for Scientific Psychology by Sigmund Freud. He wrote that in 1895. It was never published in his life, but it is part of the collected works. And it's a really fascinating little article where he tries to portray the psychic system, the psyche, and all of that as a set of transformations, essentially. Now, the metaphor is of a steam engine, and that's actually why the word drives came forth. Not a really good translation of what is actually much more desire in the original German. And very different recasting of the project. So I've put that one first because historically that came first, but I would suggest that you read it after you've read the last reference I've put down here, The Form Within by Carl Pribram. And that's available as a Kindle book or ebook, whatever kind of reader or software you have for that. And it's a very good read, but he does a very good job of talking about the work that he did, that Carl did with Merton Gill over years to write in depth about the Project for Scientific Psychology and how it fits in to basically contemporary neurology. So anyway, in historical, the project is first, but in terms of your entry point into those things, you probably should wait until after you've read Carl Pribram's book, because then you can take some of his perspective in along with Merton Gill's and get a better appreciation of what the project was about, despite how it was translated. The other starting point is the 5-phase model article. And it's a pretty easy read. Obviously, it's way out of date in terms of what to do with neurofeedback, but I think it does a pretty good job of laying out this idea of a total shift from how the rest of the field was thinking about neurofeedback, how to conceptualize it, and how to approach it. And it's interesting for that reason too, just to read it and to recognize that despite the overt disagreements and even animosity generated by me, and then ultimately after Sue and I formed Zengar and started developing NeuroCare and NeurOptimal by the software that we developed and used. It's really interesting because basically the 5-phase model became the standard for the field despite all that animosity, except the last phase wasn't implemented if you didn't have the right equipment, and that was okay. That's mentioned in the article also. So it was always really fascinating to me to watch that dance of people trying to dismiss or denigrate what they actually were doing, but calling something a little bit different. So, and that could be a whole other webinar perhaps sometime for those who are interested. The other place would be just to reread a number of the times I've posted on past, especially some of those things in the big picture form, because there'll be variations of what you hear in this webinar peppered throughout all of those posts. So those are really good starting points for you to understand this material and help you make that Copernican revolution and transform your view as well. And you'll find that the questions then essentially don't arise. So we're really talking about the antinomy, if you will, between the classical approach and what we do. Because essentially all of these questions come from the classical approach. That will make much more sense as we go along, because the answer is really very simple as how does NeurOptimal work. It's just that a lot of questions arise around that, including specific mechanisms of action and all of that, because the belief is that essentially the classical approach is correct, and we have to fit into their model and their language and their beliefs. And that's just not all that useful in my experience. So let's talk about what the classical approach is. And this is kind of a large bin of most everything that isn't NeurOptimal. So the first thing is to recognize that the core of the classical approach is the idea that while it might be possible to understand the CNS as a nonlinear dynamical system, it's best understood and treated as a collection of anatomical subsystems that are largely localized, especially in terms of function. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later when we talk about some of the research that has been misinterpreted over the years to be seen as supporting that belief. But essentially, the classical approach is all about what is needed to localize where you're going to train, both in terms of anatomy of the brain, but also in terms of function, and therefore what specific frequency targets are going to be useful, because that's where the problem is. It's in those frequencies in that region. Makes it really complex to work that way. The second core of the classical condition approaches is that neurofeedback is based on operant conditioning or some form of train and migrate technique, always using positive feedback and positive reinforcement. In fact, forever, many of the systems talk about what's being done as giving reward to the client. Not even necessarily reinforcement to the CNS, but it's giving a reward to the client. So Sig Othmer in particular forever has talked about the reward frequency, and his belief used to be that that was the most important part, and those were always in the faster frequencies, whatever the overall frequency range was that was available at that time in a system. Whoops, there we go. So it's been interesting to me to see when that gets shifted, and now what's being talked about is that the reward is in the infra-low frequencies, which are beyond frequency ranges slower than what Sig ever thought could be measured, let alone were important, let alone were actually the most important. And so to still be trying to call those a reward is just fascinating to me. It's such a save the appearance move. Anyway, that's sort of a side note, but it's important in terms of laying the groundwork for what these differences really are, and therefore how to really understand what NeurOptimal is doing, because it does exactly represent cutting-edge neurology. The classical approach does not. So another cornerstone of the classical approach is, whether individual practitioners use them or not, is the idea of normative databasing using Gaussian statistics, QEEG. That's really the only way to proceed that gives real scientific evidence. Many also believe that neuropsychological assessment, again using normative databasing and Gaussian statistics, so standard deviation per age group in certain functional tasks, that sort of thing. That's all that gives real scientific evidence. And unless you do that, you haven't really shown, quote, how it works, which is kind of an interesting belief in and of itself. The last cornerstone kind of loops back to a couple of the others, because these really do interpenetrate, if you will. They're not completely separable components. They're complementary. The classical approach is always pushing or leading the CNS, and it believes that it has to do that because the CNS does not know what's best for it. So it's absolutely necessary for an expert to be there so that they can diagnose or understand, imagine correctly, whatever you want to say, what's wrong, so then they can give the information or the intervention or the treatment to the person who does not know and cannot know without the expert being there. And that, to me, is also a fascinating thing. It's as if the expert could walk down the street and tell people who need to come in, instead of allowing them to choose for themselves when they want to receive a service, whatever that is. So what's the NeurOptimal approach? Well, a couple of the cornerstones of the NeurOptimal approach are basically exactly the opposite of the classical approach. The CNS is a nonlinear dynamical system. That's NDS, nonlinear dynamical system. Best and really only understood using joint time frequency analysis, JTFA, and nonlinear dynamical system control theory. Now, I know that's a bunch of jargon right now, but let me kind of say a quick throwaway about it that we'll come back to. If you really want to understand how the CNS works, forget about anatomy and physiology. If you really want to understand it in terms of doing neurofeedback, you have to look purely at the surface scalp, the surface of the scalp, and the voltage drops there, because that's all we measure. That's it. Now, if you're trying to do surgery or try to diagnose and remove a tumor or something like that, it's a totally different question, and that's a totally different area of expertise. And the two don't necessarily speak anything like the same language, because the hyperspecificity of location and function that is essential to surgery is completely irrelevant to NeurOptimal. So I want you to just kind of keep that in the background, because this comes up again and again and again in people asking, well, how can you say the QEG is irrelevant? I just said it another way. I've said it in several ways. Neurofeedback is based on mathematical transformations, therefore you can forget anatomy and physiology. It's nice to know, but it's totally irrelevant to providing effective neurofeedback. So use appropriately tuned JTFA and NDS mathematics and only negative feedback. And that is what gives the system its safety, its efficiency, and its efficacy. Why only negative feedback? Well, positive feedback, the classical paradigm is when the appropriate conditions are met, the client receives an electronic M&M. It could be a ping, it could be a pong, it could be Superman flying higher in the sky, it could be the bear gets to vibrate and so you feel warm and cozy with it. Could be, but there's always something given. That is, there's some positive event that didn't exist before the conditions were fulfilled. That's really what positive reinforcement means. And the premise of the positive reinforcement is not only is it a positive event, but it also increases the probability of the behavior that led to it being given. So positive reinforcement and positive feedback are all about increasing behavior towards some target. And it has to be some target that the parts of which at least have already been a part of that organism's or that system's behavioral repertoire. You can't operantly condition something completely novel unless you're just looking at the chains of behavior. So you can't operantly condition a lab rat to fly. They don't have the capability of doing that. But you can have them learn to run around the cage so quickly and start to run up the side that then it looks like they fly until gravity does what it does. So it's really important to understand that you're not creating anything novel in operant conditioning unless you're talking about that sequence which the rat may not have elicited in their life without you reinforcing them. So positive feedback is making more of a behavior occur in order to move to a set point or target. And the problem with positive feedback is it always involves overshoot. It is absolutely impossible to directly go just to the target using positive feedback. And this is why when you put 70 degrees, let's say, as the temperature in your house, actually what happens is the temperature varies between, depending where you are in the house also, at proximity to the thermostat, it'll vary as much as 4 degrees because the furnace has to go past that 70 degrees in order to know it's time to turn off. And it takes time for the furnace to actually stop producing heat, to stop emitting heat. And if the fan is on, whatever heat is still radiating or emitting from the furnace, it's going to get propagated through the house anyway. So the more you do positive feedback, or the more you rely on it anyways, the more likely it is you're going to go past the goal that you have. And that's the basis of almost all of the side effects besides just completely doing the wrong thing in the classical approach. Negative feedback is the opposite. It's allowing the system to come back to its own dynamical range of stability. So if you've ever been on a sailboat, you know that if you let go of all the control lines and just let the boat do what it's going to do, if it's well designed and a safe boat, what's going to happen is it's going to turn itself up into the wind. And you don't have to do anything to make that happen unless you're already past certain critical limits of that particular boat. It's an inherent process of negative feedback that allows the system to come back to a dynamical range of basic resilience. And from there, you can then do what you want to. So we're using negative feedback only based on these specific mathematical tools, which are the best way to understand what's going on with the electrical voltage, the voltage drop on the surface of the scalp. And we do all that not to push, lead, or tell the CNS what we know should be happening, but we do that to facilitate the self-organizing, perception-based information processes of the CNS so it heals itself. We don't have to tell it what's wrong. We don't even have to know what's wrong. Just like with the sailboat, you let go of the lines and it will come up into the wind on its own unless you're really in a dangerous place. That's just the way it works. And it can't not do that unless you're past some of these critical levels of stability. So what was the Copernican revolution of the 5-phase model? Well, there were a number of points to it. Number one was give up looking for discrete disorders with specific treatments done at specific sites with specific targets, because that's irrelevant. At best, you're going to positively reinforce perhaps the thing you want, but you're going to overshoot that target, and in overshooting it, you're going to create side effects. And it's impossible for that not to happen, no matter how precisely you hone the specific site or the specific frequency-based targets. It's the nature of using positive feedback, positive reinforcement. Instead, what we want to do is look for what the phenomenologists call the structure. So look for the fundamental phenomenological structure underlying functionally effective neurofeedback, regardless of what the trainer or the approach is believed to be. For years, one of the things that I would do is take in trainings done on other systems, take them into the analysis functions of NeurOptimal and some other tools, and I would show how, despite what they thought they were doing, they were actually doing something very different if you looked at the entire spectral range and you looked at how certain key components would renormalize as opposed to just increasing beta and decreasing theta. And yet, despite the obviousness of those analyses, the belief persists that it really is highly specific and highly localized, and the structure of the experience of effective neurofeedback is off to the side. Instead, it's seen as the result of a scientific cause-effect demonstration of a specific effect at a specific site in a specific known disease disorder context. It's fascinating to me. Not doing this shift, the Copernican shift of the 5-phase model and NeurOptimal, therefore, keeps everything as complex as Ptolemaic astronomy. And so it's clear that the Copernican revolution simplifies everything. I just had a series of interactions with somebody who wrote me back channel, who wants to get information on the system or whatever, and basically the comment was, I really liked that it was simple, but I think it's too simple. And it's like, oh, okay, so you believe it has to be complex. I get it. That's an interesting idea that that's what you believe. It's not the case, but it's an interesting belief. Whoops. The Copernican revolution, therefore, involves a transformation, and we use that term a lot. In mathematics, a transformation is a kind of translation from one reference system to another, kind of like translating Alice in Wonderland from English into French, or English into German, or English into Spanish. For example, the world itself is essentially round. It's actually pear-shaped, but it's essentially round. However, our maps are flat, planar surfaces. That is, they're on pieces of paper. And despite what you might believe by looking at those flat representations of the world, the most direct way to fly from New York to Tokyo is almost directly over the North Pole. It's not going west or going east. It's primarily going up towards the north and vectoring over that way, because you're following the curve of the Earth, and the shortest curve of the Earth, that will be a geodesic in mathematical terms, that's not going to be a straight line. It is going to be a curve. Straight lines are simplifications, are ideal cases of geodesics on simple pieces of paper, basically. So transforming planar maps, transforming the map you see on a piece of paper into spherical trajectories on a globe, well, that's a transformation. That is a change in coordinate systems. We have to use a different language. And if you map that trajectory that in the real world is the shortest distance, if you map that onto the flat map, it will look like you're going the long way around. So it really does depend what your reference system is for you to answer questions like, what's the simplest way to do this? What's the most direct way? What's the easiest way? What's the most efficient way? So a couple of key points around the science behind to help organize it. Key point number one, NeurOptimal is mathematical transformations. I know I say that all the time, all the time, all the time, all the time. That's all NeurOptimal is. That is, what it does and how it does it is mathematical transformations. Now, I'm sure that for a number of you, you're thinking things like, okay, but what's happening in the brain? Okay, but what's happening here? Go answer that yourself if you'd like. I mean, and or look at Carl Pribram's book. He's laid all that out. And yeah, we can do that, but that doesn't do anything for you in terms of how to do neurofeedback. It also doesn't do anything for you in terms of mapping into the belief systems of those Ptolemaic neurology folks who believe that what's happening in the brain is far more important than what's happening with the voltage that they're measuring at the surface. If you think about it, the whole fascination with surface Loretta is exactly that. And for me, it reminds me so much of the original Wizard of Oz. All the flash and all the drama, and behind the scenes, it's just another guy. That's all. There's no magic to it. It's straight accounting. And if you want to do that, do it, but it doesn't guide the neurofeedback. It's these mathematical transformations themselves in NeurOptimal that provide the information to the CNS. And that information is based on the response of that CNS to the training moment to moment to moment. So why are QEEGs irrelevant? Because they're normative databases, and we don't care what the norm is. It doesn't make any sense to reference the norm when very few people actually come in because they're norm. And if they go to the norm, that may not change what's going on in their life in a way that they want. You know, it's kind of like Prairie Home Companion, you know, Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. That's kind of an interesting thing because no matter what you do, you can't have all the children be above average. That just creates a new average. Unless you maintain this fiction that there really is an average out there, and by golly, our kids are so much above average. Yeah, there are reasons to do that, but they don't have anything to do with providing neurofeedback to this particular person sitting in the office right now or sitting hooked up at home using personal right now. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The CNS then perceives that information given to it through NeurOptimal via the mathematical transformations that NeurOptimal does to the voltage drop, the voltage, the current, measured off the surface. The CNS perceives that information and it chooses what to do with it moment to moment. We're not telling the brain what to do. We're not saying, oh, you've got too much turbulence. We're not saying, oh, less turbulence is better. We're not saying, oh, yes, we want you stable, and that means less turbulence. Or we want to have more interrupts, or we want to have less interrupts. There is no norm. And, you know, just as kind of a little bit of a reality check here, I would suggest that y'all kind of think about what questions are coming up for you now, even from what I've said so far. We're just on key point one, sort of laying out some of that. How come the CNS perceives that information, what's given to it through the mathematical transformations of NeurOptimal? How come it perceives and uses that information to choose what to do? It's just like what it does all day long in every situation. It's not different. It's just that the information we give it is different from what it's used to getting because it's faster and more precise. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So key point number one, we're still on. NeurOptimal is mathematical transformations. This means it's appropriately tuned JTFA and NDS. And why? Because those things are how the central nervous system perceives and how it remembers. Now, I'm sure for a lot of you going, well, no, memory is located in the whatever, and perception occurs through an integration of no. Perception is interference patterns, and those interference patterns are directly translatable, directly expressible in certain forms of JTFA. And the information choosing, the decision making, if you will, that goes on in the central nervous system based on those perceptual events can be understood most easily in terms of nonlinear dynamical science control theory. And memory interpenetrates all of that because you can only perceive something that you've already kind of seen, and you can only remember something that you've already perceived. There's a dance that goes on between perception and memory, and we're going to come back to that a little bit later. And again, Carl spent 50 years or whatever of his life demonstrating all of this. And that's really what the brain as a holographic system means. It means there is and can't not be this mutual dance of syncopation between perception and memory in a lived, perceiving, remembering, moving human or nervous system. So the mathematical transformations of NeurOptimal speak the real language of the CNS, just like the binary code of a computer program speaks the language of the computer. That's how the computer knows what to do. NeurOptimal directly gives the CNS information it doesn't perceive or receive in any other way in the same time frame. So it's kind of like not noticing that you're losing your balance until you hit the floor. It'd be really nice to notice that you're losing your balance sooner, because then maybe you could make some corrections. But being on the floor does kind of give you a real clearly perceivable event that you're probably going to remember and say, I lost my balance. NeurOptimal is kind of like giving those early indications of possible phase shift, of turbulence to the CNS, so it can then decide what to do. It's not telling it what to do, it's saying, here's what's happening. What do you want to do about it? What do you want to do with it? Where do you want to go? Key point 2, QEEG is irrelevant. Normative databases are based on Gaussian statistics. They use linear mathematics. The CNS is a nonlinear dynamical system, so Gaussian mathematics quite literally use the wrong coordinate systems, both functionally and statistically. Do you want your spouse to give you an average kiss? Each kiss has a unique flavor, and each carries your spouse's signature. You know that it's your spouse. And the signature is in the behavioral ensemble that is that kiss. That includes the smell, that includes the temperature, that includes the tempo, that includes the texture, the kinesthetics of it, the energy of it that you feel. All of that is in there, and all of that carries your spouse's signature. And you perceive and remember all of that and more in every kiss, and actually in every gesture. Everything your spouse says and does reflects that signature to you. And this is part of the reason why, over time, little things can build up to be big annoyances, because they become integrated into that lived signature of the other. And it becomes very easy for you to perceive, because you remember, that something's wrong, or that they're angry or that they're not happy at the moment. That's how all that happens. Key point number 3, the CNS is designed for 2 primary tasks: to process information, and that really means to detect difference, because the only way to perceive is to detect difference first, and to minimize discomfort. So the CNS does 2 things. It perceives, processes the information, and memory is a part of that processing of information. And it minimizes its discomfort. This means that the CNS is designed specifically to discern levels of external stimuli and learn their meaning, to discern levels of internal stimuli and their meaning, while navigating the world and maintaining homeodynamic flow. You really want to understand the history of perception studies and functional localization in the brain, you need to remember all of that to do that. Otherwise, you think it's a collection of subsystems, and you wonder how they coordinate. So key point 4, Luria was right. Luria is a Russian neuropsychologist who actually figures quite a bit into Carl's book, not surprising. But he had a couple of really interesting phrases, or at least these are the translations from the Russian into English. So one of the points was that the CNS demonstrates graded equipotentiality. That is, there's a graded ability for virtually any part of the CNS to take over virtually any other function as needed. So that's part of what graded equipotentiality is. It's not that the occipital lobes are just brilliantly designed to process vision, but nothing else. It doesn't work that way, and it can't work that way, except at the very, 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 very extremes, and we'll loop back to that in a moment. So it's neither just globalistic nor only localized. It can't be. Virtually every subsystem interacts with, influences, and is influenced by the entire CNS all the time. You know, the way a lot of the classical research is presented, it's as if you could just remove the occipital lobe and look at how vision is processed. You can't do that. The only way you can see how human beings actually see in the world is to have a live, real human being with you. You know, no matter how deeply you implant the sensors, you still have to have a living human being, which means they're discerning internal and external differences. They're detecting those. They're maintaining homeodynamic balance, at least in terms of their own heart rate and breathing and all of that. No matter how much you try to influence it, they are doing that. So you're always dealing with embedded consciousness in the world, not this localized part that can be completely removed from this individual person and then studied that way. All of that is part of the mythology of how to pretend that the functional aspects of the central nervous system are just like the little bits and bops inside the skull. And it's this interaction influencing and being influenced by, reciprocity dance, synchronistic dance. That's actually what reveals the holographic structure of the CNS. And it's fundamentally clear from Carl's work that that's the only way that perception and memory can work, is that the brain is a hologram. That was almost an afterthought, that the holographic model of the brain. And he got to that really because of meeting with Dennis Gabor and realizing, the two of them, that it was Gabor transforms, which were really about information flow, that perfectly captured the interference patterns that Carl was demonstrating in the labs that were the basis of perception, despite the fact that you could do some localization. All of the perception involved the entire central nervous system, not just that localized region. So we're still on Luria was right, key point number 4. The CNS demonstrates graded equipotentiality, and that means that it goes along with noticing that there are 3 different types of processes that one can discern in various ways: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary is only referencing itself. In the older models, many times neurophysiologists and neurologic psychologists would talk about how sensation was a primary process. And even that's not quite true, but the primary centers of the brain are all localized incredibly deep inside the structure because they do need to be protected. If you ablate or otherwise destroy those sections, those small centers, that function will be largely lost, not completely, except in the case of, say, sensation or specific ablation to take away tactile sensation in certain parts of the body. But what happens is the body reinterprets it in terms of what its lived body is, and that's really what goes on in phantom pain. You know, you have the person who has had an arm amputated, but then will report to you that it feels like their fingers are itchy and they have to scratch them, even though there's no finger there, because the central nervous system processes all of the information coming in terms of its lived memory of what it means to be that human body. And if it originally came with an arm, it's going to have that in its system somewhere as a system memory that's accessible under the right conditions. Not all the time, hopefully, because phantom pain out in a limb that isn't there, can be really interesting to deal with psychologically as well as medically. So we have primary, which is just self-referent. It's just a one-level response, if you will. We have secondary, which is primary of the primary, if you will. That is, it's thinking about. You want to think in terms of 1, 2, and 3-step directions here. So I'll loop back for the explanation of that in a moment. So we have primary, which is single process. We have secondary, which is a process about the process. And then we have tertiary, which is a process about the process of the process. So 1-step directions, you know, I say, go to the other end of the hall, go to the hall, go to the door. That's just one thing that you have to just go to the door. If I say go to the door and then come back, now I've made it 2-step, because you have to go to the door, you have to notice you're there, that's all part of the first level, if you will, and then you have to turn around and come back. And if I say, now I want you to do this tomorrow, again, at 3 o'clock, that is, start here, go to the end of the hall and come back, and let me know that you have, write a log of it. Now you're well into tertiary process about the process about the process. And what happens is tertiary process is the easiest one to start to compromise when there's cognitive impairment. We usually talk about that as losing awareness. Well, I'm not aware of what's going on. That's really not a good way to talk about it, because what awareness is interrelates to both perception and memory. But the point is, we can look at cognitive function, for instance, in terms of primary centers, secondary centers, and tertiary centers. And what's really important is to remember that all of these different, quote, centers, regardless of primary, secondary, tertiary, all of these connect via glial propagation, the surround cells, and field effects, electrically and chemically, that is, neurotransmitters. And all of that happens much more directly, as well as quickly, than the axonal connections that everybody believes are important. And all of this is demonstrated in Priplum's work. It's very, very clear. So to me, it's fascinating to watch when other systems talk about how they have to get 2 disparate systems coherent, and they have to do that through the network of axons or direct connects that they know are there anatomically. That's not really how it works best, let alone only. And the premise is, well, that they don't have good connection there. No, I don't think that's a good way to think about it. The connection is there, or they couldn't even be doing 90% of what they are doing in their life. You're talking about how well they function with that connection. And that is secondary at the least in the way we've talked about it, if not really tertiary. Monitoring your own process of monitoring is tertiary. That requires a lot of central nervous system resource. So let's take an example from the history, because it's one that is a classic misinterpretation that has spawned a generation, actually 2 or 3 generations of research and belief around the split brain. So the original research was done by Ganziga, and it shows an integrating hologram, not a split brain actually. So what he did was he took individuals that had intractable seizure, and they cut the corpus callosum, which is the first level of direct connect between what's the separation of the hemispheres that you can do in the brain. All right? So you cut that. The thinking was you cut the corpus callosum so there can't be signal transmission across that direct route, so they won't have as many seizures. And he was just really interested in what other effects would occur from that besides, the hope for stabilization of seizure, which did happen actually. So he put people who had this corpus callosum cut, he put them into very, very controlled conditions where he could project a visual image onto either the left or the right half of each of the eyes. Each of the eyes has a left and a right visual field. It's not just that the left eye looks at the left side of what's out there and the right side looks at the right side. It's actually the interference pattern between the left and the right that's shared, and the interference of that with the left and the right that isn't, that creates what you perceive. And he was interested to see if you cut the corpus callosum, so you cut down the interhemispheric communication electrically, would that also interfere with this integration pattern of the eyes? So what he did, came up with this clever procedure. And the word yellow, for instance, written in green colored letters, would be initially projected to one half of the visual field, the left or the right, in both eyes. And what you would get back from the subject, they would read that same percept differently depending on which visual field was constrained and which visual field was actually perceiving or seeing it. One side of the visual field says first, oh, it's yellow. But the other side says, no, it's green. So one side is getting the meaning, the other is getting the visual effect of it, the hue of it, but not getting the meaning. And what's fascinating is if you do that, and let's say the person starts with yellow because that's the way the visual cortex was constrained, that's the way the visual mechanism was constrained, what they do is they'll say, oh, it's yellow. No, wait a minute, it's green. Oh, no, it's the word yellow written in green letters. In other words, the brain can't not integrate and deal holographically even when constrained to do so, because what you perceive then also is a memory moment. And the perception becomes a memory, both of which are secondary processes. And then tertiary comes in looking at that and trying to resolve any apparent contradictions. It can't not be that way. There was never a situation in all of his research that integration didn't occur with every single subject. And yet the way that's been understood in the field is, yeah, see, we got a left half and a right half. We've actually got a left brain and a right brain, and, men are more left brain and women are more right brain, or whatever. It's just not true. So I've always been amazed at how much that work has been distorted for decades, and all because of the prevailing belief system of localization with axonal ties. If we can demonstrate an effect based on the separation, then that means that it really is separate. It's a fascinating belief because it's just not true. To me, whoops, this is out of order here, sorry. Hang on a second. That just got out of order. There we go. Okay. So we're just going to skip that and come back. We're going to skip this one and come back to it a little bit later. Somehow got out of order. So neurofeedback can't not involve perception and memory. It wouldn't occur. It wouldn't occur, right? And the only way you can avoid it is unless you directly inject stimuli into the CNS. That is, it's not actually perceiving them then in terms of information. It's reacting to the physical stimuli. Do you get a sense of what I mean here? That neurofeedback is a secondary, tertiary process primarily, and train and migrate is primarily a primary process. It's a direct push at that first level. And this is what happens in lens, transcranial stimulation, binaural beats, the flashing lights, Roshi, all of that. They are directly trying to entrain, influence what the central nervous system is doing right at this moment, regardless of what it thinks it's doing and what it wants to do. And they're doing that to get it to go in a certain direction. Now, lens will say, no, it's not entrain, it's disentrain. Well, you can't disentrain. Disinformation is still information, but it's meant to mislead. There's no such thing as disinformation. It isn't information. You can call it disentrainment, but that's saying the migration effect that you want. That's saying, well, I want to get somebody out of this particular parking zone. Okay, great. So you're actually giving them a stimulus to entrain them so they migrate out of that parking zone. That's, I don't care how you slice that, it's still entrain and migrate. So perception involves secondary and primary process. The information that's taken in must have meaning to the CNS, or no learning will take place. Because learning is, all about meaning. And that means that memory fails. So there isn't any memory involved either in what's going on with lens, transcranial, binaural beats, Roshi, etc. It's just like receiving an injection or receiving a medication. As long as you take it, it has that effect. It has that constraining effect. But removing it, there's no learning. There's no memory that occurs. No lived memory in the body. So you can give somebody demonstrating bipolar affective disorder all the mood stabilizing drugs you want. If you take them away, that won't be learned behavior. They can't maintain that outside of the constraint of the medication. Neurofeedback, on the other hand, involves the creation, the restoration, the involvement of lived memory so the system itself can keep going for very long periods of time on its own resources without needing to be constrained from the outside. So both perception and memory involve secondary and primary process and also tertiary. Direct stim does not. Direct stim is just primary. The CNS must perceive the information given to it. So I can't emphasize that enough, It's not reduction of uncertainty that we're dealing with in information processing. It's integration of meaning. And that's really the difference between Gabor's work on information and Shannon's work on information. The whole idea, the Shannon idea of, decrease in uncertainty, that isn't really what information is about. That's about just the barest minimum mathematical sorting out from randomness. Those are very different things because lived human beings are all about meaning. What does the information mean? How is it useful for me? Otherwise, it's not information. It's just data. Well, it's interesting to me that, the classical approach believes that it's doing this, direct operant conditioning kind of thing, or that it needs to do these direct primary effects like happens in lens and all of that. Because the truth is no neurofeedback system has ever demonstrated actual operant learning curves. If you really do operant learning, there are very clear response curves generated in terms of the operants and how they progress and how they don't. You can even discern what reinforcement paradigms were used, what reinforcement schedules were used based on those response curves. That's part of the science of operant conditioning, operant learning. So no neurofeedback study shows any of those curves. And yet the belief is still that it's operant conditioning. It's fascinating to me because the research shows exactly the opposite. The science doesn't show that it's operant. The science shows that it isn't operant. Sterman's original study came the closest to demonstrating operant curves, but it was actually a combination of classical and operant conditioning, and those are the curves that it shows. It shows what happens when you combine classical and operant conditioning. And if you really want to go into more depth on that, you can read Pribram. He does a good job talking about that. You can also read Merleau-Ponty, The Phenomenology of Perception, if you really want to get into some heavy philosophy and psychology. But both of them did a very good job of talking about how to conceptualize operant conditioning as information processing embedded within perception and memory and not just stimulus response. The science of it shows that it is always embedded information processing within a perceptual and memory-based system that is also equally embedded. It's not just stimulus response. So, what's the science behind NeurOptimal? Well, basically, all of it is. I mean, that's the fascinating thing for me is over the years to watch people be asking, well, what's the science behind it? It's like, if you keep misunderstanding what's out there, you keep misperceiving it in terms of beliefs that don't fit, yeah, that's going to be a real question. What is the science behind it? But actually, every contemporary neurologic study shows all the same stuff that Carl has been showing since, oh God, back in the 50s. And part of the reason I really love reading his book, I really love reading that latest book, is because it to me, it reads just like the conversations that he and I used to have when we were presenting together back at SNR and Future Health. I mean, that was, and some other conferences too, but we used to have some wonderful times where we'd hang out and just talk about stuff because he's laid it out in the same ways that we talked about it all back then, and not many people really have pulled all that together. In fact, it's stunning to me how few have, because it's all right there unless you're so committed to that classical model that you say, well, I still don't know what the mode of effect is, the mode of action is. Well, that's kind of interesting. It's like, do you know the mode of action of the internet that's now bringing this information to you? Is that critical for the information that is being brought to you? Do you want to say, well, what's the science behind getting this information to me via the internet, before I'll accept the information? Well, that's an interesting concept, I mean, yeah, you can do all that if you want to, and you can trudge it all down. But in the end, it's the information that counts, not which part of your computer is lighting up at this moment in reference to this particular word that I'm saying right now, because it's never exactly the same. And that's also true in the brain. Just like that kiss from your spouse carries a signature, but is also unique. Each one, the signature is unique and each kiss is unique. There's no such thing as an average kiss. It doesn't make sense. It literally doesn't make sense. So the question really becomes, what science does everybody think is behind the classical approaches? I mean, to me, that's just stunning to believe that there is actually science behind it. It's amazing, you know? And the real answer to that question is not a lot, except for the belief-based misinterpretation of what's been done. So, any questions?
I do see some questions here, Val.
Okay. For some reason, I'm not seeing them here, so I don't know.
I will read them to you.
Yeah.
So David's asking if the slides will be available somewhere to download. Yes, we can put them up definitely in PASS. We can put them in the PowerPoint's presentations section in PASS. So Val, you'll be able to send that over to me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Next question. What is NeurOptimal's criteria for establishing the targets for the negative feedback, and what are these criteria based on? How were they determined?
There are no criteria in those terms. Basically, what's being asked is, give me the normative statistics that allow me to understand these set criteria, and there aren't any. In that sense, that this is one of the questions that is basically coming from something like, and I'm glossing a bit now, so I apologize, and maybe this person would want to re-ask the question after I say this. Every other system will say something like, well, we want to have a 20% reduction in average theta, but we want to have a 40% increase in average beta. So that's the criteria for determining right now whether we give somebody positive reinforcement. That's nothing like what we do. We don't have any kind of percentages like that. We don't have any way of looking at, oh, right now it's good, stable behavior, so we won't give any interrupts. We won't give any feedback. It just doesn't work that way. So maybe the question can be reformulated, and then I can answer it more specifically.
Okay. So we'll see if he posts anything. There's some other questions here before that.
Sure.
I want to summarize in one sentence. We measure voltage fluctuations on the skull coming from the glia cells.
No, we measure it from the entire brain, not the glial cells.
Glial cells, sorry about that.
No,
Is this now only NeurOptimal doing that, or also the other neurofeedback systems, but they don't realize it and they think they're measuring local activity?
It's the latter. It's every system does that. There's no system that doesn't do that. All neurofeedback, unless you put sensors actually into the brain, unless you pierce the skull and put the sensors in the brain, all neurofeedback systems are simply working with the electrical activity as it comes on the surface of the scalp. That's the way it is. Most want to believe that they're just looking at the activity right under that active sensor, but the data doesn't support that at all.
Okay. Next question is, how would you explain how NeurOptimal works to a client in a few simple sentences?
It's like learning to ride a bicycle. I can't tell you exactly how to ride. I can give you a basic idea, and I can help by giving you feedback, walking alongside you and holding on and letting you gradually take more and more control as you reestablish your own resilience and flexibility. The central nervous system knows how to do that from the get-go. We're just giving it information to allow it to restore that intrinsic healthy chaos, that intrinsic resilience and flexibility that's always already there.
Okay. That is simple. Well done.
Okay. Is there another?
Yeah, the next question, yeah, there are quite a few questions actually.
Oh, okay.
So the next question is, does the normal brain work under 5 MV in every frequency?
There's no normal brain. We're not in Young Frankenstein. and worried about Abby Normal's brain. It's a little historical reference there. It really, asking about a normal brain is asking like about a normal kiss from your spouse, from your partner. I mean, it doesn't make sense to do that.
Okay. Okay, so the person that asked the original question that you told him to sort of
Re-ask.
reformulate it,
Yeah.
he's written, somehow an interruption is given back to the central nervous system at one point and not another. This is what my question refers to. How is that timing determined?
It's
If there
not
was no specific criteria to generate interruptions, we would need to somehow replay all of the central nervous activity back to itself, not selectively.
basically we are replaying the entire symphony of that electrical activity. But we're doing it through the 16 components that are what change during effective neurofeedback regardless of what the problem is. So in that sense, there's a filtering that we're not just giving out the direct voltage as an aggregate to everyone all the time. But see, again, you're sort of asking the same question. You're trying to say, well, tell me the criteria. Well, there aren't any. That asking what are the criteria in those terms is trying to make a nonlinear dynamical control process into a linear discernible process, and it doesn't quite work that way. Now, what I can also say is the only way you could really get the answer to that would be to get all of the mathematics of what I'm doing, and that's just not ever going to happen. But even if you had it, because I've talked about this with Carl Pribram, I've talked about it with a couple other people who understand the mathematics. If you really got those mathematics, that's not even a question, the way you're asking it. All I can tell you is that question, if you look at the question and the thinking in your head that goes on before and while you're asking that question, basically you're saying versions of, well, what's the formula? Is it an average? Is it a standard deviation? Is it a moment of variability? Is it a third, fourth, fifth moment about the mean? Is it a correlation dimension? Is it, you're asking what formula is used, and number one, those details are never going to be released. But number two, the formula, the algorithms that are used don't operate with criteria the way that linear statistics like standard deviation and such do. That's really about the only way I can say it. Nonlinear dynamical equations are predictably unpredictable, even though they can be stated very precisely in mathematical formula. And every time you iterate them, they will give slightly different responses, despite the formula being exactly the same. Okay, other questions?
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
How are you sure? Oh, he says thank you.
Oh, okay. No, you're
How are
welcome.
you how are you sure that the turbulences are bad things for the brain?
That's another what's normal question. There's nothing good or bad about turbulence. It's information, that's all.
Mm.
And that's fundamentally important to get. Anytime you're trying to ask the criteria question, you're basically saying, okay, but how do I map this as a Gaussian statistic? How do I map this as a normal versus not normal? How do I map it as good, better, or best, or bad? How do I do that? And what I'm saying is that's not information unless you already presuppose that frame of reference. If your frame of reference is that Bordeaux is good wine and everything else isn't, you're going to exclude a lot of information. But that's because you've set those criteria. And I'm not saying don't do that. That's totally up to you. But it doesn't have anything to do with what's good or not good. That's about what's good for you because you've chosen that standard.
So the system is telling the brain what the brain is doing, and then the brain figures out on its own whether it meant to do that or not.
Whether it wants to continue, really. It's not even
Mm.
whether it meant it. It's whether it
Right.
wants to continue that process or extend that process.
It's that simple.
It is.
Yeah,
That's
it is.
right. Uh,
There are no more questions here. If anyone has any more questions, please type them in.
I'm sorry, you said there are a number of questions there
No, there
still?
are no more questions
Oh, there
here.
are
So
no more. Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I
yeah,
think
no,
I think
I'm
we're
not
done.
seeing anything. Can give another 30 seconds or so.
Sure. Works for me. And the one thing I would say sort of in sum, I would really suggest that everybody go back and reread, the four historical sources. Start with my past posts if that's where you're most comfortable. Start with those materials because that might seem more accessible. Then go into Carl's book, or maybe you like Carl's book more because it's more accessible. And then after you're done with that, read the Project for Scientific Psychology if you really want to get into sort of where this comes from originally, because it's actually a brilliant piece of work. He just is embedded in the science of his day, and so steam engines were the dominant technology. And fortunately, we've come a little bit beyond that in terms of the complexity and the sophistication of our technology.
Karen's asking, she says that she doesn't like reading ebooks with a lot of images. Does Pribram's book have a lot of images?
It doesn't have a lot. It has a couple of diagrams, and I don't even know if that's available in any other format than ebook. Um, don't worry about the images. They're drawings, and almost all of them are in other books from him or in other, available in other venues. So yeah, I agree. What you don't want to do, I think, is do an ebook, particularly on a Kindle itself, that's about landscapes of the world. I mean, to me, that kind of misses the point, or really, really detailed figures and drawings. It misses the point for me. Others may have a different experience. So,
Oh, somebody says that Pribram's book is in hardcover from Amazon as well.
oh well, there you go. That might make it easier for you. When I travel, which is less often than it used to be, but when I travel, I really love to have everything on my iPad because then I carry one thing but can have 100 different things to read if I want.
Hmm. And then one more question. Can you give a specific reference for Merleau-Ponty?
The phenomenology of perception is probably the best work overall, but if you really want to go in depth at his understanding of operant conditioning and all of that, you'd want to get the structure of behavior, which was an earlier work. That's built really specifically around those issues of what an operant is, what operant conditioning means, how it fits in the paradigm, what's the difference between the physical, animal, and human orders, what's sort of the basis of this idea of um, being in the world, that existential phenomenology phrase, what that kind of means. Um, the phenomenology of perception is probably the most comprehensive one, though. So it also depends just how deep into the pool you want to get.
Okay, perfect. So that's, oh, okay. One very, very last question and then we'll be done, okay? What do you
Okay.
think about the physiological explanations of Corinne Fournier? So Corinne, just so that everyone knows, she's one of our French representatives and she actually did a webinar, I guess, sometime last year about her explanation of NeurOptimal and how it works. So Val?
What do I think about it? I guess I have a couple of responses. One is I certainly wouldn't say it's wrong, um, because nothing that she has presented contradicts any of this. I'd be stunned if it did, actually. That'd be fascinating. But what I can say is, from the point of view of providing neurofeedback, that's irrelevant, just like Q is. You know, you may know theoretically that the machine only works in ones and zeros. It works in binary. That's a nice thing maybe to know, but you certainly don't have to know how to translate that into hexadecimal, how to translate that into the letters, and how to be looking at that when you're looking at your screen to try to understand what's the binary representation right now in what area of it. Because all of that stuff changes all the time. I think the thing that is very good about the work that Corinne and Pierre did, and I especially like their book for that reason, but it's only available in French as far as I know at this point, so that may be a bit of a barrier for many people. For those who really believe that the physiology is important, it's a nice accompaniment, if you will. Um, so it's kind of like the garnish on the plate, It's not the core of it for me. And part of the reason that I keep saying that and saying that again and again and again is because the physiologic anatomic kind of bias is so predominant out there that it almost becomes addictive when you get information that kind of goes along with that or corroborates that, or it kind of excites that hunger. Like, okay, now I've got the real story of how it's working. Well, no, actually you don't. That's not the real story. The real story is the mathematical transformations. That's the real story. The real story of how computers work is not the binary bits. It's the information flow and the internet and the communication basis within which they're embedded. Without that, the bits are absolutely meaningless. They don't help. They don't do anything. And any computer can get you to access the internet, basically. So nothing specific in the binary bits help understanding how to get on the internet and communicate. Nothing in the core physiology helps you understand actually what's going on in NeurOptimal itself in its sphere of operation. It gets back to reinforcing the belief that, well, whatever NeurOptimal does, what's really happening is the psychophysiology is changing. From a pure research point of view, I would say that's never been demonstrated. But then again, I have really high criteria for what such a demonstration would be. Most all of that is sort of inference and deduction based on pulling together a lot of other sources. It's very good stuff, don't get me wrong. But to think that that's the real story is missing what the real story is. I think that's probably good, yes?
Okay. Okay, well, if there is, if there are any other questions, we do have the webinar forum within the past forums, so please, do go on there and do post your questions, and Val is on the forums regularly, so he will be there to answer them, right, Val?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Okay, and our last webinar before we break for the summer is going to be on May 31st, so it's in 2 Fridays from now. It's about gauging client shifts. It's actually going to be a discussion between myself and Catherine Boyer from New York, so I'm looking forward to that. So hopefully you can join us. If not, you can listen to the recorded version at a later date. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Val. I know that this question is one that will never die. So
right, exactly.
But something that I'm very thankful for, because I have been working with Zengar for 10 years, and so I have heard this, in some way, shape, or form many times over. And it's still, and I'm saying this because I've looked at the attendee list, and I do see that there are quite a few new names on there. And just to let you know that it's still a little bit over my head. So don't worry if you don't catch it all the first time around. And the beautiful part is that we really don't need to understand this stuff in order to get results with our clients.
And this is the bird's eye view.
Yeah,
this is
right.
the trenches. So
yeah. And the fact that all of this is built into the software, and the software is so easy to use, allows us to just focus on connecting with our client, so which is the important thing. So thank you very much, Val. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.